So welcome and thank you all for joining us today for what is the first in a series of online events that we are running throughout March for our Evidence Matters campaign. My name is Vanessa. I'm the Interim Executive Director at Evidence for Democracy. And for those of you who are meeting us for the first time, and I really do hope there are some new friends in the audience today, Evidence for Democracy, or E4D, is the leading nonprofit organization promoting and advocating for the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making in Canada. And we do this work because we believe that we all benefit when governments make decisions informed by the best available evidence. So today, as you know, we're unveiling our new evidence guides and also our new website for the Evidence Matters campaign. You can find that at evidencematterstome.ca. It's available in English or French. And my colleague, Nada, will drop that link in the chat for you now so that you can check it out. I will pass things over to my colleague, Caitlin, shortly, who will give a more in-depth intro into this campaign. But I do want to take this opportunity now to thank Canadian Heritage for their generous support that made this Evidence Matters work possible. And before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Let's all take a moment to recognize the benefits that those of us who are settlers experience as a result of historical and continued colonialism on these lands, and reflect on how we can do our best to respect and stand in solidarity with those who are here first. And today we'll be talking a lot about scientific evidence. So I'd also like to hold space for the Indigenous scientists among us. And in particular, I want to highlight a really beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. My colleague will drop a link to that book in the chat as well. It's written by Robin Wall-Kimmerer, a trained botanist and a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And she writes about understanding the world through both the lenses of Indigenous wisdom and scientific knowledge. So I invite you to check that out if you're not already familiar. A couple of housekeeping notes before we move forward. Both the chat and the Q&A functions are available to you today. So throughout the presentation, feel free to ask questions, share comments, or even share relevant resources that you might know of that you would like to share with others on the webinar today. And lastly, we do have closed captioning enabled for this webinar. So if you would like to turn that on, you can find that function if you navigate to the bottom of your screen. So with that, I'd like to introduce Caitlin Fowler, who will be taking us through the webinar today. Caitlin holds a PhD in biological and medical engineering from McGill University and came to E4D first as an intern and is now our senior research associate. Caitlin's doctoral work took an interdisciplinary approach to examine how brain structure and chemistry are altered by age, Alzheimer's disease, and anti-inflammatory treatment. So the equally interdisciplinary nature of science policy was a natural next step for her. She's led the development of all the evidence guides you'll hear about today, so there's no better person to guide us through the Evidence Matters campaign. So with that, Caitlin, please take it away.
Thanks for the intro, Vanessa. So today I'll be going through the Evidence Matters guides and the campaign, and feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. I'll be trying to keep an eye out for that as well. So Vanessa went over this briefly, but who doesn't love visuals? So we're the leading fact-driven, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization promoting the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making in Canada. We do this through original research, issues-based campaigns, and skills training, and the purpose is to engage and empower the science community while cultivating public and political demand for evidence-informed decision-making. Some examples of our recent work, specifically starting with research, include interviews with Canadian MPs to see how they find and use evidence in their decision-making process. That's our Evidence in Action report. We also explored the state of misinformation in Canada and summarized a number of policy options in our report titled Misinformation in Canada, Research and Policy Options. That was in May 2021. And then most recently, our research has focused on whether or not the public can find the evidence governments are using to make decisions. And so that's our Eyes on Evidence series. We published the last report, so what we heard, back in December of 2022. On the training side of things, we posted a number of webinars and trainings, and we also have a range of resources available on our website. This includes toolkits for preparing plain language summaries, connecting with your political representatives, addressing misinformation, and a few others. And then finally, on the campaign side, we've run a Vote Science campaign for a few elections now, where we advocate for science during both federal and provincial elections. And of course, this current campaign, Evidence Matters, which I'll be talking about today. So overall, our work is focused on closing the critical gap between decision makers and the best available evidence, because what good is evidence if it's not accessible to those that need it or want it? Now, the Evidence Matters campaign builds on our previous work by focusing on the public as decision makers and users of evidence. So Evidence Matters is a national knowledge and skills-based campaign that seeks to empower the Canadian public to use evidence to inform their decisions and to hold individuals and organizations accountable for the claims that they make. Now, why does the Evidence Matters campaign exist in the first place? Why do we need it? So we're living in a time where mis and disinformation are pretty much everywhere, and where personal beliefs and opinions or alternative facts are becoming more and more influential. Quick definitions here: misinformation refers to false or misleading information spread regardless of intent, whereas disinformation is false information or misleading information spread intentionally to deceive. The presence of either in our daily lives, makes it hard to know what information to trust. So this flood of unreliable information impacts decisions in all aspects of our lives, from choosing which car to buy to deciding whether to support a government policy change or even vote for a specific candidate. Without good evidence, our ability to make informed decisions and communicate rationally as citizens is seriously compromised, and this threatens the health of our democracy. Now, this issue can't be solved with one technique alone. So in addition to reactive techniques like debunking, we also need proactive upstream approaches, ones that center information and science literacy and empower individuals to seek out and interact with evidence. By providing the tools to think critically about information and discern the reliability of the evidence we do encounter, we can improve our collective capacity for informed decision-making and civic engagement. So that's why today we're thrilled to present our first ever Evidence Matters campaign, funded through the Digital Citizen Contribution Program by Canadian Heritage. Our goal with Evidence Matters is to build a common language of science and to foster engagement with and discussions about evidence, effectively placing evidence at the heart of navigating everyday life. Ultimately, we seek to expand public discussions about what we know and how we know it. The campaign centers around two resources: a guide to understanding evidence and a guide to asking for evidence. In a guide to understanding evidence, readers learn how to think critically about everyday evidence, from social media ads to claims made by politicians. And then in a guide to asking for evidence, we offer direction on how to ask for evidence from different sources, including organizations, journalists, and elected representatives. We also developed a companion guide to understanding scientific studies for people that wanted to learn the basics of scientific research. And this is so that readers can understand key components and conclusions of scientific papers. This resource is more detailed and definitely a little more dense than the other two guides. So I won't be going through it today, but I can answer questions about it at the end if anyone wants to know more. Now, before we get into the guides, Nada is going to put a poll up. Let's just see how confident we are in distinguishing truth from mis or disinformation in our own daily lives. So if you want to, hopefully the poll is visible to you all. If it's not, please comment in the chat. All right. Nada, I can't actually see. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So it actually looks like we have about 78% of people who are fairly confident, but will check for facts or more information. And 22% of folks are very confident in their ability to spot unreliable information. So we'll stick with the 78% who will be looking for facts or more information, because that's exactly what we'll be working on today, is thinking about ways to think critically about information and where to look and how to look for more information as well. And for those of you that are very confident, hopefully you'll still learn something. Okay. So this guide, we'll kind of get into the first guide now. This guide was designed to help readers think critically about evidence and information they encounter in their daily lives. It can be broken down into the following sections. Why does evidence matter? What exactly is evidence in the first place? And how do you think critically about it? So starting with the first section, why does evidence matter? Evidence is an important part of how we make decisions because it reduces uncertainty and clarifies what we know or don't know about something. It helps us decide who and what to believe. So this is applicable to everything from small personal choices in our daily lives to government policy actions that impact how we live. For example, you would likely look for reviews and recommendations or weigh the pros and cons when looking to buy a new phone or take a new vitamin. Similarly, people in influential positions, such as public health professionals and politicians, should make decisions informed by the best available evidence. Now, what exactly is evidence? How do we define it? So the Cambridge Dictionary defines evidence as one or more reasons for believing that something is or is not true. And another way to think about it is that it's any information that supports or contradicts a claim or assumption. Information used to make decisions or understand something is often collected through recorded observations, otherwise known as data. So everything from rainfall or traffic patterns to public polling to economic outputs can be recorded as data and used to support or contradict a claim. So for example, global mean air temperature data demonstrates an undeniable trend of warming from 1880 to 2021, supporting the claim that climate change is indeed happening. Now, we do recognize there are many more forms of evidence that inform our choices than just scientific research or data, including experience-based knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and more. But for the purposes of today, we will be focusing on scientific knowledge, kind of broadly speaking. Now, it's important to note that evidence can change, and this is something we've seen in real time over the past few years. Evidence is simply information. So anytime there's new research, we gain more information. The fact that evidence changes does not mean that science is flawed or untrustworthy. Instead, think of evidence as a constantly evolving body of knowledge that's revised as we learn new things, basically like an encyclopedia. Repetition of scientific studies, debate, and review by experts enable us to determine what information is most reliable, what is not reproducible or is outdated, and what is the most likely conclusion we can draw. If you think about all the things we do differently now compared to what our parents or grandparents did when they were growing up, like wearing seatbelts or smoking indoors, that's all because of things that we've learned. So as our understanding of the world around us evolves, so does the way we interact with it. Now on to the most practical part of this guide. How do you think critically about evidence? So let's start with considering credibility, both of the evidence and the source. You can ask yourself, who funded the research? Do they have a vested interest in the results? And might that influence the study and its findings? So for example, the tobacco industry has a long history of funding research studies that downplay the health risks associated with smoking. Where was the research published? Was it published by a reputable journal that requires rigorous peer review? Peer review is just basically looking over by a group of identified experts in a field. Preprint services or servers allow researchers to upload manuscripts without peer review, without anybody else looking at it. And this allows folks to get their findings out to the scientific community more quickly. But this means they have not been reviewed by experts, and findings should be interpreted with caution. I've used a preprint server before to upload a manuscript. It doesn't mean you can't trust the information that's on there. It just means it has not been peer reviewed. So you have to think a little bit more critically about the information that you're reading. For credibility of the source, that's the next section. If we think about who is providing the evidence, we can ask ourselves a few questions. Are they acknowledged as experts? Does this fall within their realm of expertise or lived experience? You can check if they're affiliated with a reputable institution or organization, or if they've been quoted in recent media. Also think about, what is the purpose? Is the information intended to inform and teach, or to sell and persuade? So for example, this is an old ad by Vitamin Water that basically says more vitamin C, more immunity, less snotty tissues, flu shots are so last year. This is from 2011, I believe. So this ad appears to suggest that its drink could be as effective as the flu shot. And this was clearly a marketing attempt to get people to buy their product. However, the information provided is absolutely misleading. And in fact, there were several kind of health campaigners that asked Vitamin Water, as well as a number of advertising kind of standards agencies to get this taken down. Looking at the next two sections, so consensus around the evidence and relevance. So consensus, if a study produces a new finding or one that opposes an entire field of evidence, that finding should be interpreted carefully until other studies consistently support and show the same results. Ask yourself, what are other people saying about it? Experts frequently critically review other authors' work, so look for recent reviews by reputable sources. Now, looking at relevance of the evidence. What is the population being studied? So studies involving animals or human cells are incredibly useful, but they are never a direct substitute for researching humans. So consider if a claim is overstating or generalizing findings from one population to another. How old is the evidence? Science moves quickly. Knowledge is constantly being refined and updated. So if a study is several years old, it's worth checking to see if newer information exists or if recent studies support that older evidence. And finally, if references are mentioned, do they actually relate to the claim being made? So just because a source is included or linked doesn't mean that it automatically backs up the claim or is a reliable source of information. So go beyond the headline or title. Make sure you try to read the sources for yourself to see if they actually support the claim. And finally, thinking about objectivity of the source. So is the information presented in a way that appeals to your emotions? Findings should be discussed objectively using neutral terms, ideally not emotional language. So for example, anti-vaccine sites frequently tie vaccination to a violation of civil liberties, or eco-friendly products might try to invoke feelings of guilt or social responsibility. This phrasing appeals to the reader's emotions and targets their personal beliefs and values instead of actually focusing on the evidence behind the claim. Is the source known already to be biased on certain topics? So for example, media outlets. Most media outlets try to present stories objectively, but many still have biases that influence how information might be framed. You can check out mediabiasfactcheck.com to see what kind of biases your news sources might have. Now, it's important to note that this is by no means an exhaustive list, and if information doesn't pass one or two of these criteria, it doesn't necessarily mean it's unreliable. So for example, under credibility of evidence, we talked about who funded the research. Now, most clinical trials, for example, are funded by pharmaceutical companies, so they can test if their drugs are effective, meaning that the company has a huge financial stake in the product being evaluated. It doesn't necessarily mean that the science itself isn't valid. It just means you may want to consider the findings more carefully than if a certain study were funded by a more neutral party. Now, if we think about relevance of the evidence, let's say a study was done in mice, not humans, but a science reporter took the findings out of context and implied the findings are directly applicable to human. This actually happens all the time. So this falls under relevance of evidence, where the reporting misleads readers into thinking a scientific finding is applicable to humans when it's just not the case. You can check out this very fun Twitter following at just says in mice for more examples like this. So now we have some tools to think critically about the evidence we come across in our daily lives. But what if you're looking for evidence behind a specific decision or claim, but you can't find it? It's a good opportunity to ask. So this guide offers some practical ways to search for information effectively online, as well as how and what to ask for. So the focus of this guide is on accountability and how asking for more information holds politicians, journalists, companies, individuals, you name it, accountable for any claims or decisions that they make. In fact, asking for evidence has broader implications beyond just helping you access more information. The more public demand there is for using and sharing evidence, the more responsibility those making the claims will feel in order to maintain their audience, profit, or support base. So before we get into this guide, we have a couple of poll questions for you all. So starting with, when you encounter a claim, how often do you look for more information? Almost every time, sometimes, rarely, I'm not sure. And you'll see another poll question is up there, which I'll show on the next slide in a moment. But you can answer 1 and 2, or just 1, whichever one you want to get to, you can start with. All right, we'll give it a couple more seconds. So the second poll question asks, which 2 sources do you rely on most to confirm or validate information? So choose the 2 that you typically use. Someone you know, public expert, social media, news sources, government sources, scientific publications. And then if it's none of the above, please write your answer in the chat and we'll take a look at some of those. All right, so we have a pretty even split between when you encounter a claim, how often do you look for more information? 48% almost every time, 50% sometimes. So that's great. We see lots of folks checking the information they're encountering. And this guide will help you if you don't typically look for additional information. This will give you some tips and tricks for how to do so. And then, okay, which 2 sources do you rely on most? It looks like the most are scientific publications. I'm going to hazard a guess that we have some scientists in the crowd. Public experts are the next highest, news sources, government sources. Very few for social media, and 9% for someone you know. So that's a really nice even split. I'm just going to take a look in the chat and see if there's anything in particular that comes up. Okay, I'll continue to keep an eye on it, but I think we'll keep going. Perfect. Okay. So if you are looking for information online, oh, sorry, I forgot about this part. So in the chat, this is something that we can also get you to put in. Tell us about a time when you did question a claim or when you asked for more information. And so something that comes to mind for me anyway is a couple of my friends were talking about different natural deodorants or natural kind of antiperspirants. These are ones without aluminum in them. This was a big thing on social media, I think in the last 2 years or so. And it was primarily, when you kind of try to look it up, it primarily links to health concerns about breast cancer and also Alzheimer's disease, actually. So I kind of did a bit of my own searching and looked into a couple of publications and news articles. And it turns out there's not enough evidence to support the kind of health concerns that are in there. So I ended up, continuing to use my aluminum antiperspirant. But that is something where this was something I heard from a number of people, saw on social media, wasn't sure about it, and ended up doing an online search to try to figure out what I should believe and what kind of was based on science and that kind of thing. So if you have any examples where this happened in your daily life, or when you did reach out to someone to try to confirm or get more information, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and we'll take a look at those as we go on. All right, so starting with, if you do want to find more evidence on your own, how can you find that information in an effective way? So with things like policy announcements, an ad, news articles, those kinds of things, you can look for links or references. So often you'll see a reference formatted as Smith et al. Journal of Medicine 2020, or written basically as something like based on research by Smith conducted at X university or institute. A good reference should provide enough information for you to do an online or library search to track down the original source. When you are looking, Be specific and try to avoid confirmation bias. So avoid using questions or statements that imply a certain answer. For example, searching how many grams of protein does an adult need per day will return more neutral results than do adults eat too much protein? And it'll be more specific than daily protein intake if that was your search term. You can also modify your search using symbols to get more specific results. So there's a few examples shown here. The plus symbol ensures specific words must be present in the search results. So if I search Statistics Canada survey plus household income, I will only get Stats Canada surveys on the topic of household income. Oppositely, the minus symbol excludes words to filter out information you don't need. So if I search airborne diseases minus COVID-19, it'll give me information on airborne diseases that are not COVID-19. And then finally, quotation marks allow you to search for an exact phrase. So let's say you saw a toothpaste ad and you remember hearing Sensodyne toothpaste reduces sensitivity in 30 minutes, and you want to find out more about that exact ad. If you search that within quotations, it will only give you results that have those exact words in that exact order. There are a number of different symbols you can use. These are just a couple examples. All right, so if you can't find the information that you want online and you want to ask, how do you ask it? So if you're going to take action for a company or organization, you do have the right to accurate information about what you are buying or supporting. If you're asking a company, influencer, or organization, emailing the person or organization making the claim, or often reaching out on social media are both good ways to start a conversation. Most company websites will also have a phone number, either to ask questions or at least direct you to the right people. If you want to ask a municipal, provincial, or federal elected representative, public servants at all levels of government have a duty to answer your questions or to help you find answers. So contact information for elected reps can typically be found with an online search or using specific search tools. So for example, the City of Ottawa has a Find Your Ward and Councillor search tool, while the House of Commons allows you to find members of Parliament in their public database. Also, a good tip is that it's easier to send an email, but a direct phone call or even physical mail is more likely to elicit a response. And finally, if you want to ask a question of a journalist or media outlet, they typically have a specific contact person or a website section where you can make a complaint or ask a question. You can also write to the journalist directly using contact info on the news website, or you can often contact them through social media. News sites also have an ombudsperson, so someone appointed to investigate complaints, or sometimes you may be able to use features on social media itself to flag an article as misinformation, in addition to reaching out to the outlet. So once you've figured out who to contact, what do you ask? Your message can be quite straightforward. So something as simple as, I'm contacting you today in regards to the claim or decision that I saw or heard made by you, your organization, your government, and then you insert the claim or the decision. I'd like to know more about the information behind this claim or decision. Can you please provide me with the supporting evidence? Other phrases that could be appropriate might be something like, I'm a constituent in your riding, and I want to better understand the decision by this person because it affects my ability to do this thing. Or maybe I have a background in this topic, and I'm concerned that the claim you made about X, Y, or Z is not supported by current evidence. So things like that. In general, it's important to encourage dialogue. The person or organization you're contacting may feel like you are challenging them on their claim and could get defensive or try to shut down the conversation. Approach the conversation with respect, an open mind, and a willingness to listen in order to have the most productive discussion. Now, what if the response isn't what you're hoping for? It's entirely possible that you never receive a response, or the response may be defensive, combative, or confusing. Well, this can be discouraging. Don't give up. You do have a right to this information, and you can follow up if the response is hard to understand or if it's incomplete. You may need to try again or find a new way to reach out, or maybe you can simply commit to asking for evidence in other situations in the future. So whatever happens, know that asking for evidence is all part of civic engagement. And every time you ask, you hold an elected leader, a journalist, or a company accountable for the decisions, claims, and promises they make. It might not feel like it, but you are making a difference, one conversation at a time. So your toolbox for navigating today's information landscape is now pretty full. Our two main guides aim to help you think critically about everyday evidence and offer direction on how to ask for evidence from different resources. And then if you do want to understand key concepts and conclusions of scientific papers, you can look through our third guide, Understanding Scientific Studies. In addition to the guides, we have an awesome month of programming lined up with events, panels, and activities for you to participate in. So of course, we have our webinar today and then events every Wednesday throughout March. So on the 15th, join E4D and freelance journalist and children's author Joyce Grant as we talk with representatives from Let's Talk Science, Civics, and Youth Climate Lab about ways to help youth navigate the intersection of science and democracy. On the 22nd, Globe and Mail reporter Carly Weeks will be hosting a panel with representatives from the Global Commission on Evidence, Science at First, and the Samara Center for Democracy on how citizens can develop skills to better understand and engage with evidence, and how these skills can be used to contribute to a healthier society and democracy. And finally, we end the month with Evidence Day, during which E4D will be hosting a conversation with Dr. Mona Niemer, Canada's Chief Science Advisor. You can register for these events at evidencematterstome.ca, which brings me to our new website. So you can find information about the campaign, download the guides, sign up for the events, participate in polls, lots more at the newly launched website, evidencematterstome.ca, and this is available in both English and French. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in getting this campaign off the ground, including the Government of Canada for funding the work, our volunteers, and Maureen Smith for providing a public perspective on early versions of the guides, and of course, all of you for showing your support by tuning in today. So with that, I think I will stop sharing and open the floor to questions.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin, for that great presentation. So we have about 20-ish minutes to do a little bit of Q&A, or actually really just we could just have kind of a more interactive conversation about what we've heard from Caitlin already today. Because it seems like our audience today is pretty knowledgeable and pretty confident in their ability to assess evidence. So, if you have any questions, please feel free now to put them in either in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll wait for those to come in. And in the meantime, I'm going to scroll back up in the chat and see if there is anything that's already been put, or any questions that have already been posed there. Okay, there's a great comment here by Scott, actually, that I do want to note. So Scott says that evidence need not necessarily reduce the uncertainty or the estimated uncertainty associated with the claim. That's a great point, actually. Thank you, Scott, for raising that. And it's really, it's really more about the cumulative weight of the existing evidence. So an individual, again, to Caitlin's point that she made during the presentation, a single study may reduce or increase uncertainty in something that we know. So it's really about kind of the consensus knowledge around an issue. We have a question here from Ted. Caitlin, would you have any suggestions on who or what government, media, organizations to reach out to when there is obvious misinformation in commercials?
So I think that one, it likely depends on the media in which you found the commercials. So whether that's, if it's social media versus the news versus that kind of thing, I think that would affect kind of who you're looking to reach out to. So for example, let's say something came up on a CBC News kind of talk. You could reach out to the CBC ombudsperson. If it's elsewhere on social media, I would have to do a bit of searching to figure out who the best person to reach out to is there. So for example, that vitamin water ad, I don't believe they were ever legislated to take that down, even though folks advocated to, I believe it was called the Advertising Standards Agency. They were never legislated to take it down. So there are a number of folks you probably could reach out to. How effective it will be likely depends on the extent to which the kind of controlling agencies deem it misleading or kind of threatening to the public. Vanessa, do you have anything to add there?
I mean, no, I think you've already made some great points there. I think, again, like if you see it on social media, you can report it directly as misleading information or disinformation. And then, you know, depending on the severity of the mis or disinformation, you can bring in elected officials to get their input or to bring their attention to it. Here's a great one from Elizabeth. Thanks for your presentation and for the clear guidance on how to ask for evidence. Can you comment on the challenge with the public finding time to advocate for evidence transparency as a tool for civic engagement? Are there effective strategies to mobilize the public?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things we are hoping to achieve with this campaign is mobilizing more folks to get involved, even if not as a collective, just to take the time to do it on their own time. Again, that's obviously not going to be as effective as if we have a large group of people kind of advocating for change. But the more folks that are working on it on their own kind of end will make a difference. In terms of finding the time to advocate, that's definitely something that is a challenge. I think there are a number of different, this actually will kind of touch on Ted's question as well, a little bit. There are other organizations working to do some work like this. So, for example, Civics is a civic education organization that is also working to, they have a campaign called Control F, which basically helps youth search effectively to kind of understand the credibility of a source. So there are other organizations that are doing work like this. They're trying to reach kids or like folks at the youth level, which hopefully will help as the youth, you know, get older and start being more involved. I think that's kind of the best we can be doing right now, unless there are kind of government-led initiatives that are helping mobilize the public. So, you know, for this campaign, for example, this is funded by Canadian Heritage. So the government of Canada funded this campaign through Heritage, through the Digital Citizen Contribution Program. And the goal of that program was to equip citizens with the tools for combating mis and disinformation. So there are some steps in the right direction. I think there's a lot more that can be done as well. And if anybody has suggestions for how the public can mobilize, we are more than happy to hear them.
Yeah, and I love this question because truly all of us, we're all busy individuals, and it's you know, it's hard to find time to advocate. But one thing that I will add is in terms of things you can do is simply to support organizations, you know, like us, but of course not just us, who do the work of the advocacy. For example, you could look, depending on the issue that you care most about, you could support more environmentally focused groups who are pushing the government to be more transparent about the kind of environmental evidence that they're using to make their policies. So I would say, you know, support the groups that are kind of doing the work of engaging and pushing government. Okay. there's a lot coming in now, which is great. And I'll just also note that, for folks on this call, definitely scroll through the chat to see the examples that people have been posting about the times that they've asked for evidence. It's so great to see kind of the huge variety of topics that folks have already kind of engaged with elected officials and companies and other, people in positions of authority, engaging with those people for evidence to back up their claims. It's so great to see. And I'll also just say, one of the things that I hope results from kind of this webinar, but also kind of our collective conversation over the next month, is that those of you who already are knowledgeable and are very well practiced at looking for evidence and asking for evidence, understanding evidence, that you will talk more openly and with those around you, friends, family, networks, about the importance of evidence in decision making and kind of in everyday life. It's just important to continue having these conversations. Okay.
There's actually a comment that I wouldn't mind addressing if that works.
Yeah, of course.
So Joyce, who is going to be on our panel next week, so please tune in, asked, can you talk about freedom of information searches? It has been so helpful for journalists, but the backlogs are massive now. And what's interesting is that's something that ties both this campaign and our previous research together really nicely, because our previous research, called Eyes on Evidence, basically looked at how feasible it was for someone outside of government to find and understand the evidence used to support government policy decisions. And what we basically found was it's really hard. It's really hard for someone in the public, outside government, to find that information to understand why decisions are being made. And it kind of ties into the Freedom of Information program, because if governments are not providing that information proactively, and people need that information, they will try to find a way to find it. And one of the ways that people, including journalists, do look for that information is through kind of the ATIP, or Freedom of Information program. So the more proactive governments can be with the information that they provide citizens, the less burden there is on that program, but B, the less misinformation can fill those gaps, right? Because if the government is talking about a certain topic and they don't give a whole swath of information that was used to rationalize a decision, someone will fill that gap. Whether it's misinformation or actually accurate information, you don't really know. But if the government is not providing information, it will be filled, and we can't really anticipate what will fill it. So that's a great question. And yeah, it ties both our research and the campaign together, because asking for evidence is an important part of kind of understanding the world around you, really.
Thank you. Okay. Here's.
Ashley asks, any good guides to reading a scientific paper for lay people? Yes, we wrote one. So there is a third guide. I didn't talk about it today, but there is a third guide available on our website called Understanding Scientific Studies. And it goes over both kind of how a study is structured, as well as what things you can expect to see in each part of a paper. They are tricky. I will say that even after grad school, it's still challenging to get through many scientific papers. There's a lot of jargon, and it's a lot of complex information. But the more you practice it, the easier it'll get. And focusing on key sections like the abstract will give you a good sense of kind of some of the main conclusions of most papers.
What's a good way to address the issue that a lot of disinformation is designed to discredit trustworthy institutions and experts?
I would say, so one of the big factors in mis and disinformation is trust. And so the fact that many disinformation techniques are trying to undermine that, does provide a challenge. Specifically for things like, I'll just use an example. A lot of folks don't always trust information coming from the government. And so one way to get that information to different individuals is through people in their communities that they do trust. So if there are influential people in their community or organizations that folks really align with and trust strongly, then having that information relayed through those people is likely to be more effective than if it comes from a government source, for example. Vanessa, anything to add on that? But yeah, basically kind of initiatives to increase trust in areas in which it has been lost is what I would go with.
Yeah, I think you've hit it on the head there. I think trust is the main, is the operative word of the day here. I think though, there's a bit of a difference between kind of ways to deal with disinformation and misinformation, right? Because disinformation by definition is spread with the intent to mislead, intentionally mislead, and it often different disinformation is designed to kind of capitalize on the existing points of tension and polarization, that are already there. So I think, the only way is to, well, I guess one of the only ways is to really equip people, as we're trying to do through this campaign, to equip people and help people be resilient against mis and disinformation, be able to recognize when there are attempts at manipulating them. And ultimately, again, it comes back to trust. If folks trust their institutions, trust their public institutions and experts, then they are less likely to fall prey to disinformation. Okay. There
is a quick note that, so we posted a resource list on the Evidence Matters website, but the link doesn't appear to be set for public viewing. We will get on that. It would be great if, so there's been a lot of really excellent resources posted in this chat. We'll get the link up and working properly as soon as we can. And if you are willing to drop your resources into that list that we've created, that would be great, because it'll just contribute to how broadly we can share it. But yeah, we'll get that fixed.
Okay. Okay, so here is one about how we decide if something is factually true. So clearly it must be supported by evidence, but how compelling must or should the evidence be in order to decide a specific claim? And the example given here is about the effectiveness or not of masking. In law, there are different standards of proof for determining factual findings. But what about in science?
I would say science is probably a little bit behind law in that sense, in that we don't likely have a great standard for deciding what is true, I guess, if that makes sense. I would say generally what we try to do is see what the consensus is. And so looking for things like systematic reviews where there is, someone has compiled as much evidence kind of as they can find on a specific topic, and ideally also addressed any contrary evidence. That is, I would say right now, the gold standard for determining kind of where a certain field or topic is at is looking at different systematic reviews, and just trying to find the consensus. But yeah, I don't think we have a great standard of truth for science, but part of that is because it's always changing. So maybe not the best answer there, but I think that's probably where we're at.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say we've seen this kind of like specific challenge play out during the pandemic, right? What do you do when evidence is evolving and we don't know the answer to something? How do you make those decisions? And I guess, and again, I think it comes back to kind of the cumulative weight of evidence, and I think one thing that we see play out in the media, that we often see play out in the media, that's extremely unhelpful, is, they'll bring on, one expert on one side of the issue and then one expert on the other side of the issue, and they'll say, okay, now debate each other, present your evidence, make your case, and then, the public will decide who they agree with, without revealing that often one side, one expert has a lot more kind of accumulated evidence behind their case compared to the kind of the opposite side expert who might have one or two controversial studies that they might point to. So I think again it kind of comes back to this kind of accumulated weight of evidence. Okay, we have about 5-ish minutes left. So if you still have questions or comments to make, please do that now. Okay, so here's one from Penny. It can be challenging trying to determine which organizations are unbiased and which are simply pushing an agenda. I check out all sources online, but it is sometimes hard to tell. Oh,
it's okay. I think I read it before it went away. Okay. Is there a way to check if outlets are biased? I think is what the question asked. There are a couple of different resources online. So the media bias fact, it was in the presentation, mediabiasfactcheck.com is a good one. You can kind of type in your typical news source, so CBC, Toronto Star, whatever it is, and it gives you a sense of if it leans politically one way. Perfect, someone dropped it in the chat, thank you. If it leans one way or another politically, typically how accurate its statements tend to be, and it actually gives a really good breakdown of kind of how it scores the bias of a specific organization or news source. That's the one that I've come across the most often, and it is based, like, it's primarily centered on American news sources, but there are a number of Canadian ones that are in the database as well. Does anybody else have one that they typically go to when they're looking at bias for news sources? I know I came across another one, but I can't remember the name of it right now. Vanessa, are there any you use, or people can drop them in the chat as well?
Yeah, I would invite folks to drop any resources that they know of in the chat that we can kind of pull together to share on our website. Okay, I think we can do one or two more.
There was one by Scott. Your suggestion about systematic reviews really only works in the context of decisions with a very long time frame. But in the pandemic and other emergencies, many decisions are hot or decisions have to be made on very short timescales, and there's not necessarily as much evidence. So not necessarily enough to conduct a systematic review. What then? I think that's when decision-making obviously gets really, really tricky. And I think that's also when decisions tend to be made on decision-making, does involve a number of factors anyway. Political kind of ideology, science, evidence, things like public polling, financial implications, lots of different factors. But I would say when there is less evidence, folks probably rely on those other factors a little bit more to guide their decisions, for better or for worse. But if you don't have the enough evidence to support to support a decision, you are going to look for other information, whether that's scientific evidence or financial implications or, X, Y, and Z. I think that's where those other factors play a heavier role.
Loving all the the suggestions in the chat there. Thank you very much.
The understanding of statistics is one that's come up a couple of times, and I can tell you that again, as someone who has done grad school, it is hard to understand stats. It is not a simple process, and that's how a lot of misinformation or kind of skewing of results often happens. Is some finding will exist and someone will intentionally or unintentionally poorly interpret the information that the statistics provide. I don't think there's a super easy way to address that other than, looking at different guides for kind of simple statistics. But I would say that is definitely a tricky one to address without a lot of time spent reading scientific papers and understanding statistical analyses.
Here's one about what do you do when the misinformation comes from a religious group or person? Maybe I'll just kind of broaden that out a little bit to kind of what do you do when the misinformation is kind of believed by kind of the belief comes from kind of a deeply held belief or ideology? How do you try to adjust that?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is making sure that the person or organization or whoever's giving out that information, that when or if you choose to kind of combat that information, you are not attacking the person or their beliefs. Often that will just cause a lot of kind of defensiveness and unwillingness to kind of engage in conversation. So there, the purpose would be to kind of address the information itself and present the information that is correct, and just try to explain how their perception or argument is often kind of a logical fallacy, like Penny has been saying. It's tricky, but I would say that is the main thing is look at the information and not the person's beliefs or values. Yeah,
that's such a tricky situation, right? And I'm sure we all kind of have experiences, the stereotype is, at the Thanksgiving dinner table and your aunt or uncle believes something really, really, really wild. And, how do you address that? And I think all we can really do is ask questions and present the reliable information that we know, and try to help them think differently about the information that they're encountering, without kind of attacking the person directly or attacking their beliefs directly. These are, again, kind of ongoing conversations that we all need to have, more publicly, but also privately with the people we love. I know I certainly have experiences talking to people I love and having those local conversations. And with that, I think this is a great place to leave it. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for how interactive you've all been in the chats. We'll definitely look through and pull out all the useful resources that you've shared. And, you know, we might be able to actually do a little summary of what's happening in the chat, because I think there's just a lot of rich content in there that's worth putting together and sharing more broadly. Before we go, I just want to note that, you know, when you sign off, you'll receive a little survey. Please take a moment to fill it out and let us know what you thought about this webinar. And we love feedback. That's the only way we can improve. So thank you all again. And I hope that you'll continue engaging with this campaign throughout March, and we'll see you all in the next one. Thank you.